You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. I am thrilled to have Brian Librach joining me on the podcast today. Brian started his career in retail at just 21 years old and quickly worked up the ranks to become Vice President of Stores for Urban Outfitters. Since then, he's also served as Vice President of Stores and Operations at Pacific Sunwear, and most recently, he ran stores internationally for Old Navy. Brian is passionate about helping retail teams to improve their performance, and he has a new book out on this very topic. It's called The Retail Leader's Roadmap: Take Control of Your Career, Unlock Your Potential, and Drive Toward Retail Leadership Success. Now, we're going to welcome Brian onto the podcast in just a minute, but before we do that, I wanted to let you know about a live webinar that I'm hosting next week. It's a Rethink Retail webinar with the retail technology company Diebold Nixdorf. We're going to be talking about retail mobility and how brands are embracing this technology, not only to elevate the customer experience, but also to solve problems, things like addressing the workforce shortage or improving productivity. So we're going to be looking at mobile self-scanning trends. We're going to talk about some of the challenges, things like retail theft. That's a hot topic, as we all know. And we're also going to be looking at the opportunities and where we see things moving in the future. So things like direct payment, for example, as in you won't even need to visit a dedicated till in the future, but we'll be making payments within the device. Things like real-time personalization, that is very much the direction of travel. And also, maybe using these devices to help retailers become more transparent with their ESG data. So there are a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of different aspects for us to explore. I think it's going to be a great conversation. It's a free webinar, and we want it to be interactive. So if you want to join us and get involved in the conversation, the webinar is going to be on Tuesday, May 28th at 3 p.m. UK time or 10 a.m. Eastern time if you're in the US. I'll include the registration link in the show notes, or you can head over to the Rethink Retail website for more information. Okay, without further ado, let's get on to our main conversation today and welcome Brian Librach to the podcast. Brian, it's so great to connect with you and have you on the podcast today. You have been all over my LinkedIn feed over the past few weeks, so it's great to get you on the show and to hear firsthand about your new book, about your retail experience, and also to get your general observations on what's happening in the industry. So we have a lot to get into, but first, tell us a little bit more about you and your background in retail.
Yeah, Natalie, thanks for having me on as well. I'm excited. So I'm 35 years in the business, 3.5 decades. I started at the age of 12 years old, paying taxes in the U.S., which I shouldn't have been able to do, but I did, and been doing it ever since. My father was a retailer, my grandfather was a retailer, so it's a lineage. It's in my DNA. It wasn't an accidental career choice. I knew it was what I was going to do, and I had a clear roadmap, and that's why I wrote this book 35 years later, is because I don't believe the roadmap exists in the way that it did for me 35 years ago, because I knew exactly how to get where I needed to get to based on my father and based on my grandfather. So that's what this book is about. Retail Leaders Roadmap is a way for me to share those 3.5 decades and, make sure that it's very relatable for folks so that people can realize what their potential is and get to where they want to get to.
So let's talk some more about your book. The first thing I want to say, Brian, is congratulations, because I know it is no easy feat to write a book, right? So yeah, congratulations. It's a labor of love for many of us that have written books, and I hope that you're taking some time to celebrate the launch and all the hard work that I'm sure it took to get you to this point. So congrats.
Thank you very much.
Tell us a little bit more about the book. What led you to write the book, and what do you want the industry to take away from it?
Well, I mean, I've been in the business, like I said, 3.5 decades, and things have changed, right? Evolution, things have evolved. And the generalist, in a lot of cases, has a lot more on their plate than they once used to have and a lot less support. And so I believe that, maybe 20% of leaders out there take the time to actually invest in people. And that's not a good number. Some cases it's because they don't care, but in a lot of cases it's because the scope has gotten so big that they're just doing the best that they can to keep their heads above water. And so I believe that the employee, whether you're a specialist or a generalist or a leader, now is a bit more of an independent contractor. It's the loyalties that used to exist don't exist anymore. And so an independent contractor has to build their own brand, and they have to learn and develop the skill sets themselves, and they have to use resources to be able to do that, mentors. They have to follow the right people, and they have to use internet, whatever it might be, that's going to help them get what they need. And so that's what this book is meant to do. It's a way for me to, hopefully, not hopefully, it's a way for me to positively impact more people than I could working for one organization, whether that was Gap Inc. or whether that was Urban Outfitters or PacSun. And like what we're doing here, impact folks in multiple different countries. And I believe that anybody who reads this book cover to cover will understand what it takes and then use this book as a diagnostic tool when they're struggling to get unstuck. I believe the information is in there, and over the next few years, as new information becomes available, we'll update it to make sure that it's current as well.
Right. And I want to ask you specifically about upskilling. Do you think retailers today are doing enough to invest in their staff, both in terms of kind of general training, but also in terms of investing in digital competencies?
No, I don't. I don't. I think my wife and I run a company called the Well Wisher Company, and we like to refer to ourselves as we're in the people productivity business. And there's no conversation about people productivity. It's all about generative AI. It's all about tools. It's all about resources. It's finding ways to do more with less. Again, I'm an operator. I completely get it, and I think it's going to help, because I think what's going to happen is, as these tools evolve, the the small minor things that people are spending a ton of time on, they won't have to anymore, and they can really lean into solving problems. But people aren't paying attention to the productivity that simply people being engaged can deliver. And I believe people are given 60% right now, maybe 70%. And it's not because they're not working hard or they're not trying. They're just not emotionally connected to the work any longer, in most cases. And so they're rationally committed to the work. They get a paycheck and they give the very best that they can at the time, but they're just not embracing it the way that they need to. So to me, it's just about finding a way to engage people, and yes, teach them the technology that's needed, because obviously we're all going to have to continue to learn more about that. But spending time on really knowing how to communicate with folks and how to influence folks to be the very best that they can be, I think that's going to be a game changer. And that's what I'm setting out to try to influence the best that I can.
Now, well, I think one of the brilliant and probably very unique things about this industry is that you can legitimately start out on the shop floor stocking
Yeah.
shelves, and then with enough hard work and determination you can go on to become the CEO of a business. And I think that is pretty special about retail. But as you say, retail has become less attractive as a career option, and it is a problem for the industry. So I think retailers are having to work really hard to attract and retain talent. And I'm curious to know, maybe you've addressed it in the book, or maybe you just have some thoughts on it more generally. But aside from financial incentives, which is a good place to start, um, how else can you ensure that you get a motivated workforce? Is it granting more flexibility? Is it giving store managers or staff the autonomy to make decisions at the local level? Is it about being rewarded in different ways? What can you do to ensure that your staff are feeling empowered and engaged?
Yeah, I think everything you just mentioned is important. I think, pay is of course important, but it's never the main reason why people leave jobs. Every survey you take, you hear that. The number one reason, I think, and what I notice in every survey that I've ever been a part of, is it's their leader. If you're leading well and you're observing and you're paying attention and you're giving feedback, if people are growing, they're going to be engaged. And to grow people, it's not easy, right? If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. You have to pay attention. You have to observe. You have to get out of the office. You have to be in front of people. Like, you have to witness what they're doing so that you can give them examples of what they are doing well so that they do more of it, or examples of what they're not doing well so that they can course correct it. But that's not happening at the rate that it should be. And from what I can tell, people have followed me when when they're growing, when they're developing, and they feel like they're doing their very best work. And I know that that's who I've worked for, like when I'm developing and when I'm growing. So to me, that's the key. Yes, flexibility is important. Letting people, making sure people own the business. The whole conversation around Gen Z and Gen Alpha is they need to feel like they have a hand in the way the company operates. So I think all of those things are important, but at its core, people need to be present. Leaders need to be present, and they need to be paying attention, and they need to be able to, in the book I talk about, like, see it, say it, both positive and negative. And negatives, maybe I shouldn't say negative, criticism or corrective criticisms, they have to be willing to be on the floor, whether that be walking around the office and talking to folks. Now that's a whole nother challenge because nobody's back at the office either. But I think the new way that we're operating today is going to require people to think differently about how they can observe and give feedback.
That's so interesting. You've touched on a lot of points that I want to come back to, including this idea of, execs on the shop floor and getting closer to customers and experiencing what they experience and all that. So we are going to come back to that. I want to touch on something that you mentioned, though, which you sort of alluded to, this idea of squiggly careers, which I have had a squiggly career. I worked really hard in my 20s and 30s. I then very predictably had a baby, took some time off. In the UK, you get a whole year off. So I took a lot of time
Hmm.
off, and then kind of came back to work and tried to work part time and then have one day a week writing a book. I was writing my Amazon book and then have one other day a week. So we're on Thursday now. And then on Fridays, I had a day off to be with my son. Now, I wasn't doing anything particularly well when I was trying to do all of those things. And it actually brings up an important point because I want to come back to focus and how it relates to retail in a little bit. But I guess just this idea of squiggly careers. I know you've been very open about making lateral moves throughout your career and
Hmm.
even accepting demotions in order to ultimately get ahead. So, can you talk us through this and what you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I mean the biggest the one demotion I took a huge pay cut and went from running 100 stores to running 8 stores, I think, and moved 3,000 miles away. But it was because it was for a company that I wanted to work for and a person that I wanted to work for, and I had confidence that if I basically did the pillars that are in this book, I knew I'd be right back where I needed to be in a relatively short period of time, and thankfully I was. But the whole idea of, like, talk about like focus and whatever it might be, you know, whatever you're doing at that present moment, and I know that's kind of a kitschy phrase, you have to give it its attention. So even like you just mentioned, if Thursday is all about your son, then you have to put the phone away, and that's it. Like, be phenomenal at Thursday with your son and be phenomenal at Friday with whatever that might be. I found that to be the way that I can prioritize. I talk a lot about prioritization in the book because people have a hard time doing it, because if you prioritize something, you have to deprioritize something. And that's what people don't want to do. So when I decided to make the change, or take the demotion, or take the lateral move, I had to feel confident that I would do the work necessary to get back to and then further along, and put my ego and check my ego at the door, which is not an easy thing to do. Um, but what I'm finding, at least in the industry today, so many more people are taking positions that are either lateral or completely different within retail, right? They go from operations to being an allocator to being back in the field, whatever that might be. And that spider webbing, if you will, helps them because ultimately they're taking in all these inputs and they're going to have a more broad skill set.
Interesting. I want to talk about culture and this idea of bringing your people with you. And obviously, we're in a period of profound structural change. And I feel like I've been using that phrase for at least 10 years now, but it's true, right? There's just so much change and disruption. Now, earlier this year, I chaired the tech and digital stage at Retail Week Live. This is one of the biggest retail events on this side of the pond. And one of our speakers was Ben Fletcher, who is the CFO of the Very Group, which is a big online fashion retailer. And he talked about their digital transformation journey and all of the tangible metrics that that entailed. But he said that the hardest thing was actually the cultural shift because it's so tricky to measure, it takes longer, but it's so critical to get your people on board. So I'm curious, Brian, what's your experience been like, or what are some kind of general observations that you might have, having been part of large retail organizations during this period of so much disruption? What have you observed in terms of cultural shifts?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it's the catchphrase for quite a few years was change management. I keep hearing it, and I think that is what's happening, right, with the cultural shifts. I think two things have to be prevalent. There has to be trust, and there has to be an openness to learn. And when you have an openness to learn, you're willing to try out new things. And that's what a new culture is. It's operating differently. And if you trust your leaders and if you trust the company, then you trust that it's going to work out. And if it doesn't work out, you trust that they'll shift, right? But when you don't trust your boss, when you don't trust the company, you're not going to change. You're not going to be open to it. And if you're not open in general and you're not curious, obviously, even if you trust people, you're not going to be open to what new change is coming about. I joked earlier about like the conversation for a lot of years. My father says it, his father said it, like this younger generation, right? Like it's like, no, it's evolution. Like every generation has been fine, right? They've all found their way. Um, but I think people get stuck and they get in this they get in their head and their egos get in the way. And what I'm finding with smaller organizations is obviously it's easier for them because they have 5, 10, 15, or 20 stores, or they're just starting out with brick and mortar and they've been doing it online only. And there's a lot of those companies that are starting out that I think are going to be the most nimble. It's the big companies, that have,
Mm.
50,000 employees and 1,000 stores or 500 stores that are going to have the harder time because they've got a much bigger ship to turn around. Um, and that is going to take more time. And trust isn't paramount right now in organizations. And leaders don't have the time to connect the way that they really should. So that's what I think is making it a big challenge today for the bigger companies. I think a lot of the smaller companies are going to win because they're going to have the ability to be nimble.
Yeah, just that little bit more agile than some of the big retail super tankers. Now, Brian, you ran store operations for a number of big US retailers. Do you think that the industry's perception of bricks and mortar has evolved in recent years? And also, I guess as a follow up to that, what more do you think can be done to ensure that physical stores stay relevant for shoppers today?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, COVID created a very different environment, and obviously, online was, the online business was projected to continue to grow, and then with COVID, it obviously skyrocketed, and then kind of settled down a little bit, and now all of a sudden, brick and mortar matters again. It's one of those things where in retail, I find that people swing the pendulum so harsh in one way or the other. So it's all about online or it's all about brick and mortar. It's never like 51-49%. Like, and that's the reality of where it should be, whether it's 60-40 or 70-30, but there's a blend. And I've yet to see a company do a really good job at making it all work and everybody get along and play on the same team, right? There's the online team and there's the brick and mortar team. And with ship from store and all these different incentives out there that store teams have to do to help support online and vice versa, that's the challenge. And I think the companies that can figure out how to make it feel like you're one team, those are the ones that I think are going to win. And that's also why I think the smaller teams are going to have a better chance at it because they're smaller and they're more nimble and they get to, again, interact and engage, I think, more effectively. But brick and mortar it's going to matter, and in a lot of cases, it's more of a showroom. I remember years ago when I was with Urban Outfitters, we closed a store in Manhattan and we saw our online business drop dramatically within that zip code because we no longer had a showroom. And so although we might have been losing money in that location, we ended up losing more money because we shut it down and we lost the customer that was going online in that area. So there's this understanding of the balance of its importance. In some cases, it's going to drive ROI and it's going to put money on the, it's going to put money in the bank. In other cases, it's going to be a marketing tool that you have to pay attention to from the online side of things. So it's the relationship between the two that matters.
Yeah, it's that all kind of elusive halo effect, right? Where having a physical presence actually does drive online sales. As counterintuitive as that might sound, it's yeah, so interesting. And now, the new industry buzzword is unified commerce. We've sort of gone from
Hmm.
multi-channel to omni-channel to unified commerce. And I think it's as an analyst, it's just so fascinating seeing how it's evolved. And at the end of the day, I guess it is just shopping, right? It's just that it's getting easier,
Yeah.
more relevant, more seamless, more personalized. So as retailers, a lot of hard work happening in the background to deliver that seamless experience. But Brian, let's continue with the theme of stores, and I want to ask you about how we measure success in a physical store setting because we think about traditional KPIs, things like same store sales growth, sales densities. We know that these traditional metrics are just no longer relevant. They don't reflect the way that we shop. As we just said, today we shop on our terms. We might not go into a store to buy something, but we might go in because we want that showroom experience. We want to touch and feel the product or try it on or talk to a member of staff, etc. So I'd love to know, how do you think we should be measuring store success today? Do you think we should be looking at things like staff satisfaction, customer dwell time, what percentage of online orders are collected or returned in store? So I'd love to get your thoughts around this, and I guess it's sort of reflective of how we're seeing the overall role of the store evolving as well. So over to you, Brian. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember quite a few years ago, when I was with Gap Inc., there was an attempt to incentivize folks based on purchases being done within the zip code, for example. So you weren't just incented on whether they purchased in your store; you were incented on whether or not they went home, jumped online, and bought something because maybe they experienced something in the store. And so it didn't work in the way that it was very difficult to track. And teams really didn't know whether or not it was working. And so in retail, we tend to be, I liken it to, we have a need for instant gratification. Most people that have chosen this profession, especially those that are in stores. And so the challenge of the way that we probably need to incent folks is that it's not immediate, and it takes some time to really understand its impact. Dollar per square foot's always been a favorite one of mine. But to your point, nowadays that's not necessarily the case because there has to be an understanding of the online component. There has to be. And so at the end of the day, if the store or the zip code or the area code, however we want to look at it, if money's not making it into the bank, that's going to be the problem. And profitability is not talked about in a lot of cases at the store level. And some companies do a really good job of making sure that store leaders understand the profitability of their store. And some companies don't even want the regional directors to pay attention to it because they feel like all they should be doing is executing. But at the end of the day, the profitability of a space is paramount, because if you can't pay the bills and you can't pay the mortgage, the rent, and then you can't run the business. So I think it's about teaching people how to be business owners. But even that, it's tough because you may lose money in your store, but yet it still benefits the company because of the online side of things. And so how do you share that information as well? And that's where I think that relationship, again, is so critical. And I don't know that I've seen many people figure it out.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about winning retailers. Retail is incredibly bifurcated right now. There is this growing disparity between the winners and the losers, but some retailers just keep getting it right and are thriving despite all of this disruption. Are there any retailers or brands out there that you admire, Brian? And what is it that they're getting right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, I personally like to shop on Abbot Kinney in Venice Beach, or Ossington in Toronto. So like those are the types of streets I like to shop, and it's a lot more smaller. In a lot of cases, what was considered DTC companies or things of that nature. But like Vuori is a good example of a company that I enjoy. I was on Abbot Kinney a couple months back, and they were the busiest store on the block, and I mean busy by 10 times everybody else. So there's this bit of this like it's not athleisure so much for me, but it is comfort, but fashion at the same time, I think has been huge. Faherty is another company that's kind of, I think they have 25 or 30 stores in the US, and they're starting to expand outside of the US. Again, the quality of the product is really top notch, but the experience online is great. The experience in the store is great. The employees are engaging. They have a staff. That's the other thing. Like if I walk into a Faherty or Vuori, there's a staff, and I don't know how they're covering the payroll, but there's a staff, and hopefully they are, so they stay in business. But it feels good to have that level of engagement. Whereas most retailers I walk into today, the tables are disheveled because there's nobody there to maintain it as well, let alone right interact or engage with you when you're in the fitting room. So I think it's this interesting balance of if you have the right product, you could price it right so your margins are good. You can have payroll to be able to take care of your customer. The flip side is the value players are still doing exceptionally well in the US, right? The dollar store, TJ Maxx, Ross, they're doing exceptionally well. Again, obviously, given the economy, there's an interest in folks having the disposable income for other things. But yeah, for me, I'm inspired by those smaller companies that have found a way to create amazing product, drive really good margin, and create a great experience in store.
Yeah, and I think that just shows that the fundamentals of retail actually haven't changed at all. You still need to have a good product. You still need to offer a good experience or good service. And I would argue there's probably even more of a need to do that now in this digital era where we can just get anything we want online. So if you're going to come into a store, you've really got to give someone an experience. And this whole idea of like mediocre service, I mean, customers just don't tolerate it anymore. And it just takes one
Mm-mm.
bad experience. So yeah, really, really interesting examples that you called out there. I'd like to stick with the theme of winning retailers, and I'm just going to share what I think are four key traits of successful retailers, and I'd love to get your reaction, Brian, and
Okay.
hear and feel free to disagree. A little bit of debate's always good on the podcast. So I think when we think about successful retailers, we've already touched on this idea of focus, right? This idea that you have to know what you stand for, have a clear identity, differentiate in what is an incredibly crowded market, and then you have to execute really well. I think the second thing is having a culture of perpetual innovation. So, this idea that you can never stand still in retail, that you've got to keep moving and be agile. Amazon, I think, is a great example of a retailer that is relentlessly dissatisfied with the status quo. And interesting, we're actually starting to hear, at least here in Europe, we're starting to hear more mainstream retailers taking on that mentality. So M&S, big clothing and food retailer here in the UK, they now talk of being positively dissatisfied as a word, the phrase rather that their CEO uses. So really, really interesting to see that shift. The third thing for me, customer centricity. It's a broad, kind of fluffy term, but I think a lot of retailers think that they're customer centric, but actually aren't always so customer centric.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yeah, just this idea that, you start with the customer and then you work backwards. There's no ivory towers. More and more we're starting to see retailers requiring their head office staff to spend time in stores. Carrefour in Spain and Morrison's in the UK are actually bringing customers into their management meetings. And the CEO of Carrefour's bonus is partially indexed to its NPS score. So, really, really interesting stuff happening. And then, very briefly, the last thing, and I think you'll agree with this one, is that happy staff equals happy customers. So, adopting this employee first mentality. And again, just to kind of reiterate, this idea that shoppers won't tolerate mediocre service or mediocre experiences. So that's kind of my, like, when I'm out talking to clients or giving presentations, that's my framework. That's what I think retailers need to be striving for. But what do you think, Brian? I'd love to get your take, especially around the kind of happy staff equals happy customers bit.
Yeah, yeah. I wrote all those down, so I had the notes. I think what's interesting about the focus and execution part of the conversation that you had is, I think price. I think price is extremely important in people understanding where they need to be. And I feel like you either are, at least from what I can tell in the US, you're either high or low. And that, and it's a bit, I hate to say it, but it's also class in general. Like the middle class, doesn't exist anymore. You're either wealthy or you're not wealthy. And then that's a sad reality of what we hear about. I think pricing is similar. You can't be in the middle. You're a value player, in my opinion, or you're catering to somebody who has more disposable income. And how do you stick with your lane so that you build your reputation, right? And I use Viore or Fardy as an example. Like I don't ever see them on sale. Like they're priced regular price and they're great quality, and yet then there's the dollar store or TJ Maxx where you're going to get value. So I think the folks that win with focus and attention win with the right pricing strategy. I think the innovation for me, I think it's fun to talk about it in stores, but I think it's a lot more important to talk about it when it comes to distribution and supply chain and the channels behind the scenes that get product to you faster and more efficiently, so that the store teams, districts, regions, whatever, their job is easier because of how things happen behind the scenes. And so they can actually engage and spend all of their time and energy on the customer. So I think it's tricky, but I think companies have to really understand where to invest in innovation. And I don't know that a mirror that tells me if I look appropriate or not, and I could buy that, I don't know that that's going to do much for the industry for quite some time. But I do know that if you can get the product delivered in such a way that it's already folded and it's there first before everybody else and it's easy to process, that's going to help tremendously. So I think those companies that are doing that is super important. And then your comment about customer centric and then happy staff, to me, it's the same thing. I agree with you. We think we're customer centric, but we're not listening to the customer, right? Product is being created because folks are listening to and reading the comments in social media and recognizing that people are asking for something in blue, but it's only provided in black. they make it in blue because the customer is. So customer centric isn't just about what's happening in a brick and mortar space. It's really, are you listening to what the customer is saying? And by the way, now more than ever, the customer is telling you on social media through comments what it is that they like and don't like. So it's about whether or not the whole industry is curious enough to be customer centric. And then the happy staff, I completely agree. And that is where I think you're going to have a greater focus. You're going to have better innovation, right? You're going to be more customer centric if you have a staff that is engaged. If your staff is not engaged, your innovation is going to be okay, right? Like your customer centric approach is going to be just okay. So that's why you have to start with people. And the companies and teams, well, the companies that have teams that are engaged are the ones that are going to win.
Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.